I'm going to show you a map. One map. And this map, even if you don't know anything about this war, even if you can't name the participants, even if you've never studied a single weapon system or read a single intelligence briefing, this map will tell you exactly how this conflict will progress, exactly who holds the advantage, exactly where the vulnerabilities are, and exactly why this war has the potential to collapse the global economy in a way that no conflict since World War II has threatened. Because this war isn't really about armies. It isn't about aircraft carriers or fighter jets or missile defense systems. Those things matter. They produce headlines and footage and the kind of dramatic images that dominate news cycles. But the war, the real war, the one that determines winners and losers, the one that reshapes the world order, the one that decides whether the American empire survives the next 12 months. That war is about geography, about one specific piece of geography, a narrow strip of water 33 kilometers wide, so narrow that a strong swimmer could cross it, so narrow that standing on one shore you can see the other side, so narrow that it seems almost absurd, almost like a geological joke, that the fate of the global economy depends on whether ships can pass through it safely. The Strait of Hormuz. And right now, at this moment, Iran has closed it. Not threatened to close it. Not postured about closing it. Not used it as a bargaining chip in negotiations. Closed it. And when you understand what flows through that strait, when you understand the percentages, the dependencies, the supply chains, the financial flows that all converge on this 133-kilometer choke point, you understand that what Iran just did is not an act of war against one country or one alliance. It is an act of war against the global economy itself. And the consequences are going to hit you personally in your gas prices, in your grocery bills, in your heating costs, in your investments, in the stability of the currency in your wallet. This is not distant geopolitics. This is your life, starting now. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through this map, point by point by choke point, vulnerability by vulnerability, and show you exactly why this strait is the center of the world, why controlling it gives Iran leverage that no military force can simply override, why the GCC nations, the Gulf states that sit at the heart of the American financial empire, are far more fragile than anyone in Washington wants to admit, and why both sides of this conflict have the capacity to destroy each other in ways that could cascade into something no one can control. Subscribe to join the community, leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going, and share this video, because the map I'm about to show you explains more about the next 6 months of your life than anything you'll read in the news. Let's start with the strait itself. Look at this map, right here. This narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the open Indian Ocean, the Strait of Hormuz. 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. That's about 21 miles. People have swum across it. It is, by any objective geographic measure, tiny. A sliver of water, a crack in the coastline. And yet this sliver, this crack, is quite literally the center of the world. Not metaphorically, not in some abstract geopolitical theory. Literally. In terms of measurable economic flows, in terms of quantifiable global dependencies, in terms of the actual physical movement of the substance that powers human civilization, this is the nexus, the pivot, the single point on which everything else turns. Let me show you why with numbers. Because numbers don't lie. Numbers don't spin. Numbers don't care about your political opinions or your national loyalties. 20% of all the world's seaborne oil flows through this strait every single day. 1 barrel out of every 5, loaded onto tankers in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE, Qatar, carried through this 33-kilometer passage, delivered to the world. Where does it go? Asia. Almost all of it goes to Asia. India depends on this strait for approximately 60% of its oil imports. 6 out of every 10 barrels that power the Indian economy, the economy that supports 1.4 billion people, flows through the Strait of Hormuz. China depends on it for approximately 40%, the world's second largest economy, the manufacturing floor of the planet. 40% of its oil supply through this one choke point. Japan, 75%. 3/4 of all Japanese oil imports transit the Strait of Hormuz. Prime Minister Takaichi has said it publicly, plainly, without diplomatic hedging. If the strait closes, Japan will run out of oil in 8 to 9 months. The entire Japanese economy, the third largest in the world, collapses. Not declines, not contracts. Collapses. Within 8 to 9 months. South Korea, similar dependency, similar timeline, similar consequence. And now the strait is closed. Iran has closed it. Through a combination of direct attacks on commercial shipping, mine threats, drone strikes, and fast boat patrols that have made the 6 miles of navigable shipping lanes too dangerous for commercial operators to transit, which means the clock has started for India, for China, for Japan, for South Korea, for every economy on Earth that depends on Gulf oil flowing through that 33-kilometer crack in the coastline. The global economy has 8 to 9 months, maybe less, before the energy dependencies that underpin modern civilization begin to produce cascading failures. That's not analysis. That's arithmetic. But the oil is only the first layer, because what flows through the Strait of Hormuz isn't just energy. It's the entire financial architecture of American global power. Let me explain the system, because most people don't understand it. Most people have never had it explained to them clearly. And once you understand it, everything about this war, every decision, every strike, every escalation makes perfect sense. The GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, the oil-producing states of the Persian Gulf. These nations sell oil, enormous quantities of oil, and they sell it. This is the critical piece, the keystone of the entire architecture, in US dollars. Not in their own currencies, not in euros, not in yuan, in US dollars. This arrangement is called the petrodollar system, and it is, without exaggeration, the foundation of American economic power. Here's why. The US dollar is, in a purely technical sense, worth nothing. It's paper. It's digital entries in a computer. It has value only because people agree it has value. And people agree it has value because, and this is the crucial mechanism, you need US dollars to buy the most important commodity on Earth, oil. If you're Japan and you want oil, you need dollars. If you're India and you want oil, you need dollars. If you're Germany, South Korea, Brazil, Thailand, Egypt, if you're any country that imports oil from the Gulf, you need dollars. This creates permanent, structural, global demand for the US dollar. Demand that exists regardless of the strength of the American economy, regardless of American trade deficits, regardless of American government debt, regardless of American fiscal policy. The world needs dollars. Because the world needs oil, and oil is sold in dollars. That demand, that constant, massive, irreducible demand, is what allows the United States to run $34 trillion in national debt without economic collapse. It's what allows America to print money during crises without triggering hyperinflation. It's what allows the U.S. to maintain trade deficits that would bankrupt any other nation. The petrodollar system is the engine of American empire, not the aircraft carriers, not the military bases, not the intelligence agencies. Those are products of the empire. The engine, the thing that generates the wealth that pays for everything else, is the global need for US dollars driven by oil being sold in dollars. And the GCC nations are the operators of that engine. They are the countries that maintain the petrodollar arrangement, that sell oil in dollars, that take those dollars, and this is the second critical piece, invest them back into American financial markets. Look at the data. UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, their investments in US financial markets have been exploding since 2012. Sovereign wealth funds, real estate purchases, stock market investments, treasury bond holdings, hundreds of billions of dollars flowing from Gulf oil revenues back into the American financial system. That capital flow supports American stock prices, supports American real estate values, supports the US government's ability to borrow at low interest rates, supports the entire financial ecosystem that American prosperity depends on. The GCC doesn't just sell oil for dollars. It recycles those dollars back into the American economy, creating a closed loop. Oil flows out, dollars flow in, dollars flow back to America as investment that sustains American financial power. Now, what happens if you break that loop? What happens if the GCC can no longer sell oil because the strait is closed? What happens if Gulf nations no longer have dollar revenue because no oil is moving? What happens if those nations, instead of investing in American markets, have to spend their reserves on defending themselves? on military operations, on emergency food imports, on maintaining domestic stability as their economies crater. The investments stop. The capital flows reverse. The stock market loses its Gulf support. The dollar loses its petrodollar demand. The entire financial architecture, the loop that has sustained American economic dominance for 50 years, breaks, and that is Iran's strategy. Iran's. Not to defeat the American military. Iran cannot defeat the American military. Everyone knows this. Iran knows this. The strategy is to destroy the GCC, to close the strait, to cut the oil, to break the petrodollar loop, to collapse the financial architecture that makes the American empire possible. You don't need to defeat an empire militarily if you can bankrupt it financially. And the switch that bankrupts the American empire is a 33-kilometer strait that Iran just closed. But the GCC's vulnerability goes deeper than oil revenue, much deeper. Because these nations have a problem that most people don't know about. A problem that makes them uniquely fragile in exactly this kind of conflict. Food. The GCC nations, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, are desert countries. Not metaphorically, literally. Desert, sand, extreme heat. Almost no arable land, almost no fresh water, almost no domestic agricultural capacity. These countries cannot feed themselves. 80% of all the food consumed in the GCC is imported. 80% from overseas, shipped in by sea, through ports, through supply chains that depend on, you're starting to see the pattern, open waterways. The same Strait of Hormuz that carries oil out carries food in. When the strait closes, oil stops flowing out, but food also stops flowing in. The gleaming cities of the Gulf, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, Riyadh, cities of millions, cities that look like science fiction, cities that represent the pinnacle of 21st century urban development. Those cities exist because petrodollars pay for imported food. Cut the petrodollars and you cut the food supply. Close the strait and you starve the cities. How long can they last? Reserves vary. Strategic food stocks exist, but for populations of millions in desert environments with no domestic agriculture, the timeline is measured in weeks to months, not years, and water. The GCC has almost no natural freshwater supply. The only way these nations produce drinkable water is through desalination plants, massive industrial facilities that take seawater and, through energy-intensive processes, convert it into fresh water. 60% of the GCC's water supply comes from desalination plants. How hard is it to destroy a desalination plant with a drone? Not hard. Not hard at all. These are large, fixed, industrial facilities. They don't move. They can't hide. They can't be dispersed or relocated. They sit on the coast, processing seawater, producing the water that keeps millions of people alive. One drone, one facility, millions of people without water. Can you defend every desalination plant every day against hundreds of drones launched from mountain bases across the Gulf? The answer is no. You cannot. The defense mathematics don't work. You cannot protect every fixed target against a sustained, cheap, mass drone campaign. The attacker has too many drones, the defender has too many targets, the cost exchange is catastrophically unfavorable for the defender. So the GCC sits on the map like this. Flat desert. Exposed infrastructure, dependent on imports for food, dependent on desalination for water, dependent on oil revenue for everything. And every one of those dependencies flows through a strait that Iran has closed and through supply chains that Iran can attack. Now look across the Gulf, look at Iran, and you see why this map tells you everything. Iran is a mountain fortress, not a metaphor. Literal mountains. The Zagros Range, running along the western and southwestern border of Iran, rising to peaks of over 4,000 meters. Canyons, caves, underground complexes, tunnel networks built over decades, hidden, hardened, dispersed. This is where Iran keeps its offensive capacity. Missile bases, hundreds of them, buried in mountains, protected by meters of rock. Drone factories, dispersed across dozens of facilities, many underground, many disguised as civilian infrastructure. Rocket launchers, artillery, command centers, communications nodes. You cannot see them from satellites, not all of them. You cannot destroy them from the air, not all of them. You cannot neutralize them with cruise missiles, not all of them, because there are too many. They're too dispersed, they're too deeply buried, and Iran has had decades to build, harden, and hide them. This is the asymmetry that the map reveals with devastating clarity. On one side, the GCC, flat desert, exposed infrastructure, fixed targets, water plants, oil fields, military bases, cities, all sitting in the open, all vulnerable to drone attack, all indefensible against a sustained campaign from an adversary with hundreds of thousands of munitions hidden in mountain strongholds. On the other side, Iran, mountains, tunnels, hidden capacity, an offensive arsenal that can rain destruction on the GCC for weeks, months, without being fully neutralized. From those mountains, Iran can attack 3 categories of targets. First, American military bases. There are dozens of U.S. military facilities across the GCC, in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. These bases house tens of thousands of American personnel, and they are vulnerable, not to sophisticated military operations, to drones. Cheap, mass-produced, GPS-guided drones launched from launchers hidden in Iranian mountains. Can the U.S. defend these bases? The answer, uncomfortable, embarrassing, but honest, is not completely. Not against the volume of attacks Iran can generate. Not against a sustained campaign that launches hundreds of drones and missiles simultaneously from multiple directions. Second, oil and energy infrastructure. Oil fields, refineries, loading terminals, pipeline junctions. All of them fixed. All of them large. All of them vulnerable. The Abqaiq attack in 2019, when Houthi drones struck Saudi Arabia's largest oil processing facility, demonstrated conclusively that Gulf energy infrastructure cannot be fully protected against drone attack. One strike temporarily knocked out 5% of global oil supply. Now imagine not one strike, but a sustained campaign, dozens of attacks per day, on oil fields across the entire GCC for weeks. The damage to global energy supply would be catastrophic. Oil doesn't go to $200 a barrel. It goes to whatever price the market reaches when a meaningful percentage of global supply is physically destroyed. Third, and most important, water infrastructure. Desalination plants. The facilities that keep GCC populations alive. 60% of the water supply, fixed targets, indefensible against mass drone attack, destroy the desalination plants, and you don't just damage the GCC, you kill it. Not in the military sense, in the biological sense. Millions of people without water, in desert heat, in cities built for air-conditioned comfort, not survival. This is the absurd asymmetry that the map shows. Iran, a mountain fortress, its offensive capacity hidden and protected, able to sustain attacks for months. The GCC, a flat, exposed, infrastructure-dependent desert, able to be destroyed at any point Iran chooses. At any point in this war, Iran can choose to simply destroy the entire GCC, and there is nothing that anyone can do about it with air power alone. That is what the map tells you. That is why geography is destiny. That is why this war is not about who has the better fighter jets or the bigger aircraft carriers. It's about who sits on the mountains and who sits in the desert. And in that contest, the mountains always win. But Iran has a weakness, and this weakness is as fundamental, as existential, as the GCC's water dependency, because the mountain fortress can also be a mountain prison. Iran has a water problem. Climate change, decades of drought, aquifers depleting, rivers drying. Lake Urmia, once one of the largest saltwater lakes in the world, has shrunk to a fraction of its historical size. Agricultural regions that depended on river irrigation are failing. Urban water supply is under increasing stress. Iran's population, 88 million people, depends on water infrastructure, dams, reservoirs, pipelines, treatment plants, the same kind of fixed, targetable, vulnerable infrastructure that makes the GCC fragile. And that is the American and Israeli strategy. The one that doesn't appear in press conferences, the one that isn't discussed on cable news, the one that the map reveals if you look carefully enough. Destroy Iran's water supply. Not today, not in the opening phase of the campaign. The opening phase is about military targets, air defenses, command centers, weapons depots, naval assets. The dramatic phase, the headline phase. But as the campaign progresses, as the target list evolves, as the strategic objectives shift from military degradation to regime pressure, the targeting will move towards civilian infrastructure. Power plants. Because without power, water treatment doesn't function. Pumping stations don't operate. Hospitals lose capability. Cities go dark. dams, because controlling river flow controls agriculture, controls drinking water supply, controls the capacity of a nation to sustain itself. Water treatment facilities, because destroying them doesn't just reduce supply, it contaminates what remains, creating health crises that compound the pressure. The intention, not stated publicly, never stated publicly, but implicit in the logic of the campaign, is to make Iran so uninhabitable that the population rebels, or a refugee crisis erupts that destabilizes the regime from within, or the internal pressure becomes so extreme that the leadership accepts terms it would never accept under normal conditions. The mountain fortress becomes the mountain prison, the population trapped inside, with decreasing water, decreasing food, decreasing power, and a government that chose martyrdom over negotiation. Both sides can destroy each other. That is what this map tells you. That is the fundamental, terrifying symmetry of this conflict. Iran can destroy the GCC by closing the strait, by attacking infrastructure, by drowning the desert states in drones and missiles launched from mountain strongholds that cannot be fully neutralized by air power. The US and Israel can destroy Iran by systematically degrading infrastructure, water, power, transportation, until the mountain fortress becomes a prison and the population inside cannot sustain itself. Both outcomes are catastrophic, not just for the participants, for the world. Because the GCC's collapse takes the petrodollar with it, and the petrodollar's collapse takes the American financial system, and the American financial system's collapse takes the global economy, and Iran's collapse creates a refugee crisis of 88 million people, destabilizes every neighboring country, creates a power vacuum that every regional and global actor, Russia, China, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, will rush to fill, creates exactly the kind of multipolar chaos that produces world wars. This is a game of chicken, and in a game of chicken, the side that is willing to go further, that is willing to absorb more pain, suffer more destruction, accept more loss, wins. And here is where the asymmetry becomes decisive. Not the military asymmetry, not the geographic asymmetry, the psychological asymmetry. Iran's population, Shia Muslims, many deeply religious, led by a clerical establishment that venerates martyrdom, has a cultural framework for suffering, for endurance, for accepting destruction as a test of faith. The regime has spent decades preparing its population for exactly this kind of confrontation. The killing of their religious leader hasn't weakened their resolve, it has deepened it. The GCC populations, materialistic, wealthy, accustomed to comfort, and, this is the critical demographic fact, overwhelmingly foreign. 90% of Dubai's population are expatriates, foreigners, workers who came for the money, for the opportunity, for the lifestyle. They did not come to endure a war. They did not come to survive drone attacks on desalination plants. They did not come to die for a country that isn't theirs. What happens when the drones start hitting Dubai, when the water supply becomes uncertain, when the food imports slow, when the gleaming towers go dark? The expatriates leave. 90% of the population leaves. They have somewhere else to go. They have passports from other countries. They have families waiting for them in India, Pakistan, the Philippines, Egypt, Bangladesh. The GCC cities don't just lose population, they lose function. Because the expatriates aren't just residents. They're the workers, the engineers, the doctors, the construction workers, the truck drivers, the people who keep the infrastructure running, the people who keep the water flowing and the food distributed and the hospitals staffed. When they leave, and they will leave, because rational human beings with options leave war zones, the cities don't gradually decline, they collapse. Because the people who know how to run everything are gone. This is not a fair matchup, and the map shows you why. One side has mountains and martyrdom. The other side has desert and foreigners. So the questions that hang over this conflict, the questions that the map forces you to confront, are the ones that nobody in Washington or Tehran or Riyadh wants to answer publicly. Question 1, ground troops. The only way to truly defeat Iran, to enter the mountain fortress and dismantle it, is with ground forces. Not thousands, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, moving through mountain terrain against a defender that has been preparing for exactly this scenario for 40 years. Will America send its army, 500,000 soldiers, 1 million to fight in Iranian mountains the way the Soviets fought in Afghan mountains, with supply lines stretching across the Gulf through a strait that Iran controls? The question answers itself. But it must be asked, because without ground troops, the campaign is aerial only, and aerial campaigns can destroy, but they cannot occupy, they cannot control, they cannot force a government to surrender if that government is willing to endure the destruction. Question 2, nuclear weapons. Both sides hover near this line. Iran's nuclear program, damaged but not destroyed. The question of whether a regime facing existential defeat would choose nuclear escalation is not academic. It is the question that keeps every military planner in every participating country awake at night. And the counter-question, would the United States use tactical nuclear weapons against hardened Iranian mountain facilities that conventional bombs cannot penetrate? The bunker buster conversation that nobody wants to have in public? Question 3, who else gets involved? Because this situation is so dire, the economic consequences so global, the energy disruption so universal, the strategic stakes so high, that other powers cannot remain on the sidelines. Europe, Germany, France, and Britain are already discussing intervention. France has deployed its carrier group. If European economies face energy collapse because the strait remains closed, European military involvement becomes not a choice, but a necessity. And if Europe enters, if NATO forces are deployed against Iran, the question that reshapes the world becomes unavoidable. Does Russia get involved? Does China? Russia has strategic interests in Iran, arms sales, diplomatic coordination, a shared adversary in the United States, an interest in the American empire's weakening. China depends on Gulf oil more than almost any other major economy, 40% of its imports. China cannot allow the strait to remain closed indefinitely without economic catastrophe. But China also cannot allow Iran, a strategic partner, a counterweight to American power, to be destroyed.